Sign it, Daniel. I don't have all night. I have a runway to walk in 20 minutes.
You've changed.
No. You just finally noticed.
You're going to catch a cold standing there like that. Get in, Daniel, before you drown out here for a woman who wouldn't have noticed either way.
The pen felt heavier than it should have. I stood in the dressing room behind Victoria's fashion gala, the bass from the runway show thumping through the floor like a second heartbeat, and I stared at the divorce papers spread across the vanity table. 12 pages. 12 pages to erase 8 years. Sign it, Daniel, Victoria said, not even looking at me. She was fixing her earring in the mirror, her reflection more interested in her than I was. I don't have all night. I have a runway to walk in 20 minutes. I picked up the pen anyway. 3 months ago, I would have argued. I would have reminded her that I was the one who held her hand through 4 miscarried business deals, who redesigned her failing spring collection in a single sleepless week when her lead designer quit without notice, who sat in hospital waiting rooms alone because she couldn't waste a press cycle on a family emergency. I would have reminded her of all of it. But tonight, I just signed my name. Victoria finally turned around, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not guilt, not sadness. Surprise. She had expected a fight. She had expected tears, or begging, or at least a scene she could later spin into a sympathetic magazine quote about growing apart from someone who couldn't keep up. Instead, I set the pen down gently, slid my wedding ring off my finger, and placed it beside the papers like I was returning a borrowed item. "You've changed," she said quietly, like an accusation. "No," I said. "You just finally noticed." I didn't wait for a reply. I walked past the racks of $1,000 gowns, past her assistants who wouldn't meet my eyes because they'd been trained not to see me. The quiet husband who dropped off coffee, who never got introduced at parties, who existed in her world like a piece of furniture that occasionally spoke. I pushed open the heavy steel door at the back of the building and stepped out into the alley. Rain hit me immediately, cold, relentless, the kind that soaks through a suit jacket in under a minute. I stood there for a second, letting it happen. 8 years of my life, and my exit was a service alley that smelled like wet cardboard and old cigarette smoke. For one strange moment, I almost laughed. This was supposed to be the worst night of my life. My wife, the woman I'd built an entire identity around loving, had just called me unambitious in front of her assistants and thrown me out like an old sample she no longer needed. And yet, standing in that rain, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. That's when the headlights cut through the downpour. A black limousine, sleek and silent, rolled to a stop at the curb like it had been waiting for me specifically, which, I would later learn, it had. The rear window lowered with a soft mechanical hum, and rain sprayed sideways into the warm interior light spilling out. "You're going to catch a cold standing there like that," a voice said. I knew the voice before I saw the face. Everyone in the fashion industry knew that voice. Cool, precise, amused, like she found the whole world slightly funny and was too polite to say so out loud. Genevieve Cross, Victoria's biggest rival, the woman whose name Victoria wasn't allowed to say at dinner without turning the whole meal into a lecture on corporate parasites and opportunists who steal ideas because they have none of their own. Genevieve Cross, who ran a fashion empire twice the size of Victoria's out of a glass tower on the other side of the city, and who, as far as I knew, had never once exchanged more than a cold nod with my now ex-wife at industry events. The door opened. A hand extended, not to shake mine, but holding out a folded charcoal gray coat, dry and warm, like she'd known exactly what I'd need before I knew it myself. "Get in, Daniel," she said, "before you drown out here for a woman who wouldn't have noticed either way." I should have asked how she knew my name. I should have asked how she knew where to find me, at this exact door, at this exact moment, on the exact night my marriage ended. Later, I would realize those weren't coincidences at all, but standing there, soaked to the bone, with nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go, I didn't ask questions. I got in. The limousine was warm, smelled faintly of cedar and rain-soaked leather, and impossibly quiet compared to the storm outside. Genevieve handed me the coat, and I noticed her eyes weren't on my face. They were on my hands. Specifically, the faint calluses on my fingertips, the kind you get from years of sketching, cutting fabric, pinning seams late into the night. The kind of hands nobody at Victoria's gala had ever once looked at twice. "You have talented hands, Daniel," she said. "It's a shame nobody in that building tonight ever bothered to ask what they've been making." My chest tightened. Nobody was supposed to know about that. Not the sketches. Not the fabric samples hidden in my old studio closet. Not the truth about who had actually designed half of Victoria's award-winning collections while she took every bow under her own name. Genevieve reached into a leather folder resting beside her and pulled out a single crisp document, sliding it across the seat toward me. Embossed at the top, in gold lettering, were words that made my breath catch. "Co-Chief Executive Officer. I've been watching you for a long time," she said softly, her eyes steady on mine, unreadable and warm all at once. "Longer than you'd probably be comfortable knowing, and I think it's time the world finally saw what you're actually capable of." Outside, the rain kept falling, the city lights blurring gold and red across the wet windows. Somewhere behind us, Victoria was probably already walking the runway, unaware that the man she just discarded was sitting in her greatest rival's car, holding the first page of the story that was about to end her empire. I looked down at the contract in my hands. Then I picked up the pen she offered me, and for the second time that night, I signed my name. 3 days later, I sat in an office with more glass than walls, watching the city stretch out beneath me, like a map I'd never bothered to study before. Genevieve's headquarters was nothing like Victoria's. Victoria's building was all marble and mirrors, designed to make visitors feel small and underdressed. This place felt different, quiet, deliberate, like every inch of it had been built for people who actually worked, instead of people who just wanted to be seen working. On the desk in front of me sat a stack of legal documents an inch thick. My name was printed at the top of every page: Daniel Reyes, sole creative rights holder. For 8 years, I had designed almost everything that made Victoria famous. The signature draped sleeves on her breakout collection, the asymmetric hemlines that got copied by 3 other major labels within a season, the private hand-stitched detailing she bragged about in interviews as her personal touch. All of it. Every pattern, every sketch, every late night hunched over a sewing table while she slept, had come from my hands. But I had never put my name on any of it, not once. Victoria always said it made more sense for the brand to have one face, one story, hers. I used to believe that made me a good husband, selfless, supportive. Now, signing my name onto copyright filing after copyright filing, I understood what it actually made me. Invisible. You kept records of everything. Genevieve said, walking in with 2 cups of coffee, setting one gently beside my hand without asking how I took it. She already knew. Black, no sugar. Another detail I hadn't remembered telling her. Dated sketches, time-stamped files, fabric orders under your name at the mills. That's not an accident, Daniel. Some part of you always knew you might need proof someday. She wasn't wrong. I just hadn't admitted it to myself until this moment. I looked up at her. Why does this matter so much to you? You have your own empire. You don't need to get involved in whatever's about to happen to Victoria's company. Genevieve smiled, but it wasn't the sharp, calculating smile she was known for in interviews. This one was smaller, quieter. 5 years ago, she said, sitting on the edge of the desk, my company nearly collapsed. A supplier scandal, a lawsuit, and half my board ready to sell my life's work out from under me. I was drowning, and everyone in this industry either watched or celebrated. She paused, studying me carefully. Everyone except one person, a quiet man nobody paid attention to, who used a personal connection at an Italian textile mill to get me emergency stock when every other supplier had cut me off out of fear. He never told anyone he did it. He never asked for credit. He just fixed it and disappeared. My stomach dropped as the memory clicked into place. A late-night phone call. A favor for an old mentor's daughter. I hadn't even told Victoria about it. She'd been too busy prepping for a photo shoot to notice I was gone for 2 hours. That was you, I said slowly. That was you who saved me, Genevieve corrected, her voice softer now. I never forgot it. And when I heard whispers that the real talent behind Victoria's empire was some overlooked husband nobody bothered to interview, I put the pieces together long before tonight. The room felt smaller suddenly, not in a suffocating way, in a way that made the air feel important, like something significant was happening that I hadn't fully caught up to yet. So this isn't just business for you, I said. Genevieve didn't answer right away. She looked down at the coffee cup in her hands, then back up at me, and for the first time since the limousine, I saw something unguarded cross her face. No, she admitted. It isn't. Before I could respond, her phone buzzed sharply on the desk. She glanced at it, and whatever softness had been there a second ago sharpened instantly back into focus. Victoria's holding a press conference right now, she said, turning the screen toward me, announcing her personal spring collection launch next month. On the screen, Victoria stood at a podium under blinding camera flashes, beaming with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent years learning how to take credit convincingly. Behind her, mounted on display forms, were 3 gowns. My gowns. Sketches I had drawn on hotel notepads during her business trips. Patterns I had cut and pinned myself in our old apartment while she was at galas I wasn't invited to. Every single piece in that collection was now, legally, mine. She has no idea, I said quietly. No, Genevieve agreed, setting her coffee down and sliding the final document toward me. The last copyright filing, the one that would lock every design in that collection under my legal ownership before Victoria's team could manufacture a single garment. But she's about to. I picked up the pen sitting beside the stack of papers. My hand didn't shake this time. Genevieve watched me sign the last page, and when I finished, she didn't smile in triumph or gloat about what was coming. She just looked at me the way no one had looked at me in years, like I mattered, not because of what I could do for someone else's image, but simply because I existed. Get some rest, Daniel, she said, standing and heading for the door. Tomorrow, everything changes. I didn't know yet how right she was. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. I know because I was already awake, sitting by the window in the small apartment, Genevieve's company had arranged for me temporarily, watching the city wake up. My phone buzzed against the table, and when I saw Genevieve's name on the screen, I felt my pulse pick up before I even answered. "Turn on the news," she said. No greeting, just quiet urgency, laced with something that almost sounded like excitement. Now. I grabbed the remote and flipped to the business channel. A reporter stood outside Victoria's headquarters, microphone in hand, while behind her, a small crowd of employees clustered near the entrance, some on their phones, others just staring up at the building like it had betrayed them personally. Sources confirm that production has been completely halted at the company's flagship facility this morning, the reporter was saying. Employees arriving for the scheduled shipment to Italian textile mills found the entire design server locked, with all files inaccessible, pending what legal representatives are calling an active intellectual property dispute. I felt something settle in my chest, not quite satisfaction, not quite guilt, something in between, heavier than I expected. Genevieve's voice came back through the phone, calm and measured. My legal team filed the injunction at midnight, right after the copyright registrations cleared. Victoria's company has no legal right to manufacture, distribute, or even display any of the pieces from that collection anymore. Every gown, every pattern, frozen. How is she taking it? I asked, though some small, tired part of me already knew. Why don't you see for yourself? Genevieve said. I have a secure feed into the building's press room. Her legal counsel is walking in right now. She patched me into a live video link, and for the first time since I'd walked out of that dressing room 3 days ago, I saw Victoria's face again. She looked different. Not physically. Her hair was still perfectly styled, her makeup still flawless, the kind of polish that took a team of people 2 hours to achieve. But her expression had cracked in a way I had never seen before. Not the practiced frustration she performed for cameras when a shipment was delayed. Real panic. Her head tailor rushed into frame, phone pressed to his ear, talking fast. The mills say they can't even open the pattern files. Everything's been locked from the source. Legal says it's some kind of ownership dispute, but nobody registered anything outside of your name. Victoria, I don't understand. That's impossible, Victoria snapped, cutting him off. I own every design in this building. I've owned them since day one. Her lawyer walked in then, a tall man in a gray suit, holding a thin folder, his expression carefully blank, in the way lawyers get when they're about to deliver news nobody wants to hear. Victoria, you need to see this, he said, opening the folder and sliding a single page across the conference table toward her. I watched her pick it up, watched her eyes scan the page once, then a second time, slower, like she was hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Daniel Reyes, she read aloud, her voice cracking slightly on my name. Sole creative rights holder. She looked up at her lawyer like he'd just told her a joke in poor taste. This is a mistake, she said. He's not a designer. He's my husband. He doesn't even work here. Your ex-husband, the lawyer corrected quietly. And according to these filings, time-stamped and notarized well before your divorce, he holds full legal copyright over the sketches, patterns, and construction methods for every piece in the spring collection, including the 3 gowns you presented at yesterday's press conference. The color drained from Victoria's face in real time. I had seen her angry before. I had seen her cold, dismissive, impatient. I had never seen her afraid. That's not possible, she whispered. He was never involved in the creative process. He just helped sometimes. Helped, her lawyer repeated carefully, like the word tasted strange in his mouth. Victoria, based on the documentation, it appears he designed nearly the entire collection. The registrations include dated sketches going back years, fabric orders under his name, correspondence with the Milan mill confirming his direct involvement in material selection. Victoria sat down slowly, the folder still clutched in her hands, staring at nothing. "He never said anything," she murmured, almost to herself. "He never once said anything." I felt Genevieve's presence beside me, even through the phone, silent, letting the moment breathe. On the screen, Victoria's head tailor was pale, whispering something to another assistant about layoffs, about the mills pulling out, about the collection that was supposed to launch her onto the international stage, now sitting completely unusable, locked behind a wall of legal paperwork, with my name stamped across the top. She built her entire empire on something she never once thought to ask about, Genevieve said quietly through the phone, her voice carrying no cruelty, just quiet certainty. She never asked who you were, Daniel, only what you could give her. I watched Victoria bury her face in her hands on the screen, her shoulders shaking, the woman who once told me I wasn't ambitious enough to matter, now sitting in the wreckage of a collection built entirely from my invisible labor. "This is only the beginning," Genevieve added. "Wall Street opens in 2 hours, and word travels fast." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the reality settle fully into my chest. 3 days ago, I had signed away a marriage. Today, I was watching an empire begin to fall. By the following week, the story wasn't just on the business channels anymore. It was everywhere. Fashion icon's empire, frozen in shocking IP dispute. Victoria Lane's spring collection halted. Insiders say true designer was hidden in plain sight. Every headline dressed the story up differently, but they all circled the same brutal truth. Victoria's company couldn't manufacture a single piece of its flagship line, and nobody could explain to investors when, or if, that would change. I sat in Genevieve's office on the 32nd floor, watching a live stock ticker scroll across a screen mounted on the wall. Victoria's company symbol blinked red, the number beside it dropping steadily like a slow leak in a tire. "Down 32% this morning," Genevieve said, not looking up from her tablet. "Started at 18 when the injunction news broke Monday. It's been sliding every day since." "That's not slowing down," I said. "It's not supposed to." She finally looked up, and there was something calm and calculating in her expression, the look of someone watching a plan unfold exactly the way she'd designed it. "Panic doesn't slow down on its own, Daniel. Not without someone to reassure the market. And right now, Victoria doesn't have anyone." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean her board is terrified," Genevieve said. "Her chief financial officer resigned yesterday. Her PR firm dropped her account this morning. Too much liability. She's standing in the middle of a burning building, insisting the smoke isn't real, and every major shareholder can see the flames behind her. I should have felt something resembling sympathy. Some old, buried instinct left over from 8 years of marriage. Instead, I mostly felt tired, the exhausted, hollowed-out feeling of watching a slow-motion collapse you didn't cause, but also couldn't bring yourself to stop. "You're buying the shares," I said. It wasn't a question. I'd seen the pattern in the numbers on her tablet, small distributed purchases through different holding accounts, timed carefully to avoid triggering the disclosure requirements that would tip off the market too soon. Genevieve didn't deny it. "I've been acquiring distressed shares through secondary markets for the past 10 days. Quietly, nothing that would spook the remaining shareholders into thinking someone was making a move. She set the tablet down and looked at me directly. "This isn't impulsive, Daniel. I didn't decide to do this the night I picked you up in the rain." I've been positioning for this for months, long before the divorce, long before I knew for certain you'd walk out that door. That admission landed heavier than I expected. Months, I repeated. So this was never really about me. It was always about you, she said, her voice softening slightly. You were the reason I started paying attention to her company in the first place. I wanted to understand how someone with no real creative talent kept producing collections that outperformed mine season after season. It took me over a year of digging to realize the truth, that the actual designer was a man nobody in the industry could even name. I let that sit for a moment, uncomfortable and strange, the realization that I had been a mystery worth solving to someone long before I'd ever met her. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and something shifted in her expression, sharper now, focused. "It's time," she said. I followed her down to a private boardroom on the floor below, where 3 of her senior executives were already seated around a long glass table, laptops open, murmuring quietly among themselves. Genevieve took her seat at the head of the table and gestured for me to sit beside her. "Status," she said simply. One of the executives, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper voice, turned her laptop toward Genevieve. "We've secured commitments on the remaining distressed shares through 3 separate holding entities. Combined with our existing position, we're ready to execute the final purchase." "How much does that put us at?" Genevieve asked. 51%, the executive said. "Controlling stake." The room went quiet for a moment. 51%. Enough to control every decision Victoria's company made from this point forward. Enough to remove her from power entirely if the board chose to. "Execute it," Genevieve said. The executive's fingers moved across the keyboard, and I watched numbers shift on the screen in real time. Trades confirming one after another, small green check marks stacking up until the final tally appeared at the bottom. Acquisition complete, 51.4% controlling interest. Nobody in the room cheered. Nobody clapped. It was quieter than that, more serious, the kind of silence that comes when everyone understands exactly how much power just changed hands. Genevieve reached over and placed her hand gently over mine on the table, her fingers cool against my skin, her eyes steady on mine. "We own her now, Daniel," she said quietly, "just for me. Everything she built, everything she thought was hers, it belongs to us." I looked down at our hands together on the table, then back up at the screen still displaying the final acquisition numbers, and I felt something complicated twist in my chest. Not triumph exactly, not vengeance either, but something closer to disbelief. 3 weeks ago, I had been a man signing divorce papers in a dressing room, invisible to the woman I'd married for 8 years. Now I was sitting in a boardroom that had just quietly taken control of her entire empire, and she didn't even know it yet. "When does she find out?" I asked. Genevieve's smile was small, controlled, and utterly certain. "Tomorrow morning," she said, in front of everyone. Victoria called the meeting herself. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about on the drive over. She had no idea she was the one walking into the trap. Genevieve's assistant had intercepted the details through routine shareholder correspondence. An emergency session, scheduled for 8 the next morning, requested personally by Victoria to address what her office was calling a temporary operational disruption. She was going to stand in front of her remaining board members and beg for a capital bailout, unaware that the people she needed to convince weren't the same people who'd sat on that board a week ago. "She thinks she's talking to her own shareholders," Genevieve said as our car pulled up outside Victoria's headquarters. "She doesn't know she's talking to us." I straightened my jacket. A bespoke charcoal suit Genevieve's tailor had fitted me for 2 days earlier, the first piece of clothing in years that had been made specifically for me, instead of borrowed from whatever role I happened to be playing at the time. It felt strange to walk into that building again. The last time I'd been inside, I was carrying Victoria's dry cleaning. We took the private elevator to the top floor. Genevieve's legal team walked ahead of us, calm and unhurried, the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from already knowing how a conversation is going to end. Through the frosted glass doors of the main boardroom, I could hear Victoria's voice before I saw her. Steady, persuasive, the same tone she used to close every difficult negotiation. "A temporary setback," she was saying. "The legal matter will be resolved shortly, and once production resumes, we'll recover the lost quarter within." The doors opened. Victoria's voice cut off mid-sentence. She was standing at the head of the table, dressed immaculately as always, a presentation still glowing on the screen behind her. Projected charts showing a recovery timeline that, I now understood, would never happen. Her eyes moved from Genevieve to me, and I watched something complicated pass across her face. Confusion first, then recognition, then, slowly, dawning horror. "What is this?" she said, her voice losing its polished calm. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. Genevieve walked past me, unhurried, taking a seat at the opposite end of the long table, like she'd sat there 100 times before, even though she'd never officially set foot in this boardroom in her life. "Victoria," Genevieve said pleasantly, "thank you for calling this meeting. It saves us the trouble of scheduling one ourselves." Victoria's eyes darted around the room, and for the first time, I saw her actually look at the other people seated at the table. Not the board members she'd expected, but 3 of Genevieve's executives, quietly reviewing documents like they already knew every word that was about to be said. "Where's my board?" Victoria asked, her voice tightening. "Where's Richard? Elaine, this is my company's meeting." "It was," Genevieve said gently, sliding a single folder down the table toward her. "As of 9 days ago, controlling interest in this company transferred to a consortium I represent. 51%. Acquired through legal secondary market purchases while your stock price collapsed under the weight of an intellectual property crisis you created yourself." Victoria stared at the folder like it might bite her. She didn't open it. "That's not possible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Nobody informed me of any acquisition. There are disclosure requirements. There are—" "All of which were followed precisely," one of Genevieve's lawyers said calmly. "You'll find the full paper trail in the folder. Every transaction, every filing, time-stamped and compliant." I watched Victoria's composure crack in real time, the same way it had on the video feed days earlier, except now there was nowhere to hide it, no screen between us, no distance to soften the moment. She looked at me, and for a second, the coldness I remembered from the dressing room was gone entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "You did this," she said quietly. "This is you. You did this to me. I designed your collections for 8 years and never asked for credit," I said, keeping my voice steady, refusing to let it shake the way my hands wanted to. "You did this to yourself the day you decided a stay-at-home husband wasn't ambitious enough to matter." Genevieve stood then, walking slowly toward the head of the table where Victoria still stood frozen, her presentation slides glowing uselessly behind her. "Effective immediately," Genevieve said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "The board is being restructured. Victoria, you'll retain your shares as a minority stakeholder, but you no longer hold any operational authority within this company. No hiring decisions, no creative direction, no public representation on behalf of the brand." "You can't do that," Victoria said, though the fight in her voice was already collapsing. "I built this company from nothing." "You built this company on someone else's hands," Genevieve said, not unkindly, but without any room for argument either. "And those hands no longer belong to you." Victoria's eyes moved to me one last time, searching for something. An apology maybe, or a flicker of the man who used to fold himself smaller just to make her comfortable. I didn't give her either. I simply held her gaze until she looked away first. 2 security personnel stepped quietly into the room, waiting near the door. A formality more than a threat, but the message was unmistakable. Victoria gathered the folder off the table with trembling hands, her presentation still glowing behind her. Useless now, a monument to a future that no longer belonged to her. She walked out without another word, her heels echoing sharply against the marble floor until the doors closed behind her. The room was silent for a moment. Then Genevieve turned to me, and for the briefest second, I saw not the calculated businesswoman, but something softer underneath it, quiet satisfaction, and something that looked almost like pride. "It's done," she said. "The empire is ours now." I nodded slowly, watching the closed doors where Victoria had disappeared, and I realized this wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning of the part that would hurt the most. I stayed late that night, longer than I meant to. Genevieve had left hours earlier for a dinner with 2 board members who needed reassurance the transition would be smooth, and I'd told her I wanted to finish reviewing the restructuring documents alone. That wasn't entirely true. Mostly, I just needed quiet. A place to sit with everything that had happened without anyone watching my face while I processed it. By the time I made my way down to the underground parking garage, the building above me was mostly dark, just a scattering of lit offices where people worked late, for reasons that had nothing to do with me anymore. My footsteps echoed against the concrete, sharp and hollow, the only sound besides the distant hum of the ventilation system. I didn't see her until I was almost at my car. Victoria stepped out from behind a support pillar, and for a moment, I genuinely didn't recognize her. The woman who had commanded every room she walked into for as long as I'd known her looked small in the dim garage lighting, her expensive coat wrinkled like she'd been sitting somewhere for hours, her makeup smudged beneath eyes that were red and swollen in a way I had never once seen in 8 years of marriage. "Daniel," she said, her voice cracking on my name. I stopped walking. "Victoria, you shouldn't be here." "I needed to talk to you," she said, taking a step closer, her hands twisting together in front of her. "Please, just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." I should have kept walking. Some part of me knew that even then. But there was something in her voice I'd never heard before. Not the practiced persuasion she used in boardrooms, not the cold dismissal from the dressing room. Something that sounded almost like the woman I'd fallen in love with a decade ago, before the galas, before the empire, before either of us had learned how easily people could stop seeing each other. 5 minutes, I said. Her shoulders sagged with something like relief, and then, without warning, she started crying. Not the composed, camera-ready tears she'd occasionally use during interviews about the sacrifices of building an empire. Real tears, ugly and uncontrolled, her whole body shaking with them. "I made a mistake," she said. "A terrible mistake. I don't know what I was thinking that night. The stress of the launch, the pressure from the board, I wasn't myself, Daniel. You were exactly yourself," I said quietly. "That's what hurt." She flinched like I'd struck her, but she kept going, closing the last few feet of distance between us until she was close enough to reach for my arm. "Please, I'll fix everything. I'll give you full creative credit. I'll put your name on every collection going forward. I'll tell the entire industry the truth about who I really am, without you. Just please, tear up the copyright filings. Talk to Genevieve. Make her reverse the acquisition. We can fix this together, the way we used to fix everything together. I looked down at her hand on my arm, and for a moment, I felt the ghost of every year I'd spent believing that being needed was the same thing as being loved. Victoria, I said, gently stepping back until her hand fell away. We never fixed anything together. I fixed things, and you took the credit. That was the arrangement, whether either of us ever said it out loud. That's not true, she said, but her voice wavered like she didn't fully believe it either. I loved you, Daniel. I still love you. Whatever happened between us, whatever mistakes I made, that part was always real. I studied her face carefully, searching for the same certainty I used to feel whenever she said those words. It wasn't there anymore. Maybe it never had been. Did you? I asked, not unkindly, but honestly. Or did you love what I gave you? The gowns nobody knew I designed. The stability you never had to think about because I handled everything else. The version of a husband who made your life easier without ever asking for anything in return. She opened her mouth to answer and then closed it again because we both understood there wasn't an honest answer that wouldn't confirm exactly what I'd just said. I don't know how to do any of this without you, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, stripped of all its usual armor. The company, the board, the collection, none of it makes sense to me without you fixing it behind the scenes. I don't even know how to run a fitting without asking myself what you would have changed. For the first time since the dressing room, I felt something close to sympathy for her. Not enough to change anything, but enough to answer her honestly, one last time, without cruelty. That's the truest thing you've said to me in years, I said. You built an empire on my invisible labor, and now that it's gone, you don't know who you are without it. I understand that. I spent 8 years not knowing who I was without you either. I paused. The difference is, I'm finally finding out. Her tears started again, quieter this time, resigned rather than desperate. So that's it, she said. There's nothing I can say. There's nothing you can say, I confirmed, because you never needed to say anything before. You just needed me to keep showing up, and I did, for 8 years, without ever asking you to see me. I stepped back fully now, putting real distance between us. I'm done showing up for someone who only noticed me the day I stopped. I turned and walked toward my car, leaving her standing alone in the dim garage light, her reflection fractured across the polished concrete floor. I didn't look back, not because I wasn't tempted, but because for the first time in a long time, I finally understood the difference between staying out of love and staying out of habit. And I was done confusing the two. By the next morning, Victoria had found her fight again. I saw it the way most of the world did, through a live broadcast on a financial news network, Genevieve's tablet propped up on her desk while we reviewed quarterly projections for the newly restructured company. The segment cut to Victoria seated across from a well-known anchor, her composure fully restored, her makeup flawless, every trace of the woman who'd broken down in a parking garage 2 nights earlier carefully erased. "Turn it up," Genevieve said, setting down her coffee. And to be clear, Victoria was saying, her voice steady and practiced, what happened to my company was not a legal dispute. It was a coordinated attack. Genevieve Cross has spent years trying to undermine female-led businesses in this industry, and I believe what we're witnessing is a calculated campaign of corporate espionage designed to destroy everything I've built simply because a woman succeeded where she couldn't. The anchor leaned in, intrigued. Those are serious allegations, Victoria. Do you have evidence to support corporate espionage? I have 8 years of marriage to a man who apparently spent that entire time working against me from the inside, Victoria said, her eyes glistening with practiced emotion. I believe Daniel Reyes was recruited by Genevieve long before our divorce, planted in my home, feeding information to my biggest competitor while I trusted him completely. Genevieve's expression didn't change, but I felt my jaw tighten. She's rewriting the entire story, I said. She's trying to, Genevieve corrected calmly, already reaching for her phone. It won't work. She's forgetting something important. What's that? She's the only one in this story who has something to hide. Within the hour, Genevieve's PR team had assembled a response, but it wasn't a statement. It was worse for Victoria than any statement could have been. At exactly noon, Genevieve authorized the release of a full financial audit. Documents Victoria's own former CFO had quietly handed over during the acquisition due diligence process. Records that painted a picture far different from the one Victoria had just presented on national television. The audit revealed the company had been operating with hidden debt for over 2 years, propped up by loans Victoria had personally guaranteed without board approval, loans she had used specifically to fund lavish launch parties and magazine placements, while creative staff went unpaid for weeks at a time. Alongside the audit, Genevieve's team released something even more damaging: internal emails, obtained legally through the transferred company servers, showing Victoria explicitly instructing her creative team to list her as lead designer on collections she had never once sketched, cut, or personally constructed. One email, dated 3 years earlier, was particularly damning. Make sure Daniel's name never appears anywhere in press materials. This is my brand, not his hobby. The financial channels ran the story within the hour. Then the fashion press picked it up. Then everyone else. Victoria Lane's empire built on falsified credit and hidden debt, documents reveal. Internal emails expose systematic erasure of true creative talent. From icon to fraud, the unraveling of a fashion dynasty. I watched the narrative flip in real time, the same way I'd watched her stock price collapse the week before. Not gradually, but all at once, like a dam breaking. The anchor who had let Victoria make her accusations that morning ran a follow-up segment by evening, her tone entirely different now, asking pointed questions about the falsified credits and the buried debt, instead of nodding sympathetically at claims of corporate espionage. Victoria didn't do another interview after that. She tried to burn us down and ended up exposing herself instead, Genevieve said quietly, watching the coverage roll across 3 different screens in her office. There was no glee in her voice, just quiet, absolute certainty. That's the danger of building a story on lies, Daniel. Eventually, someone asks for the receipts. I sat in the chair across from her desk, watching my own face appear briefly on screen. An old photograph from some industry event. Me standing slightly out of focus behind Victoria, unnamed even in the caption. Husband of Victoria Lane pictured at 2019 gala. Even now, even in this story, I was still somewhat invisible in the public record, though, for the first time, the invisibility didn't feel like erasure. It felt like proof. The industry's talking about you differently now, Genevieve said, turning her screen toward me. A fashion trade publication had just posted a new headline: "The quiet genius behind a decade of iconic design. Who is Daniel Reyes?" I read it twice, something unfamiliar settling in my chest. Not pride exactly. Recognition, maybe. The strange, disorienting feeling of being seen for the first time in years, after spending so long believing I preferred it that way. "How does it feel?" Genevieve asked, watching me carefully. I thought about the question honestly, before answering. "Strange," I admitted. I spent 8 years convincing myself I didn't need anyone to notice, that the work was enough on its own. I looked up at her. I'm still figuring out how to want more than that. Genevieve's expression softened, something unguarded passing behind her eyes. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," she said. But, for what it's worth, I noticed a long time before any of this happened. Outside her office window, the city moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the empire that had crumbled and the quiet man who had, without meaning to, become the center of its collapse. Somewhere across town, Victoria was likely locked away in whatever remained of her home, watching her carefully built reputation dissolve headline by headline. I didn't feel triumphant watching it happen. I just finally felt real. A month passed before the industry fully caught its breath. Victoria's name faded from headlines the way most scandals eventually do, replaced by newer stories, newer collapses, newer people learning the same hard lesson about what happens when the truth catches up to a carefully built lie. She retreated from public life entirely, selling off her remaining minority shares to a private buyer neither Genevieve nor I ever bothered to ask about. I didn't feel the need to track what came next for her. That chapter of my life had finally, quietly, closed. What replaced it was something I hadn't expected to want this badly. "Nervous?" Genevieve asked, standing beside me backstage at Global Fashion Week, the two of us surrounded by racks of finished garments, frantic assistants weaving between us with pins and steamers, the electric hum of a show about to begin. "A little," I admitted, adjusting the final seam on the evening gown hanging in front of me. The show closing piece, the one every major outlet had been speculating about for weeks. I had designed it entirely myself, from the first sketch to the final stitch, working through nights in a studio that finally, for the first time in my career, had my name on the door. Reyes and Cross. Not because Genevieve had insisted on equal billing, though she had, but because somewhere over the past month, without either of us fully deciding it out loud, we had stopped being business partners who happened to share history and started being something neither of us had a clean word for yet. "You designed something extraordinary," Genevieve said, studying the gown with the same careful attention she gave every major decision. Deep emerald silk, cut in a way that moved like water, hand-stitched detailing along the bodice that had taken me 11 nights to get exactly right. "The industry is going to remember this collection for years." "Our collection," I corrected gently. She smiled, and it was different from the calculated smile she wore in boardrooms, different even from the warm certainty she'd shown me in the rain 3 months ago. This one was smaller, private, meant only for me. "Our collection," she agreed. An assistant rushed past, calling out a 15-minute warning, and the backstage energy shifted into its final gear. Models being ushered into position, makeup artists making last-second adjustments, the low murmur of nervous excitement building toward something unstoppable. I finished pinning the last fold of fabric and stepped back to look at the gown one final time, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been in years. For most of my marriage, I had done this exact work in private, hidden away in a closet-sized studio Victoria rarely visited, my name never once appearing on a single tag or program. I used to tell myself the invisibility didn't matter, that the craft itself was enough. Standing here now, watching my design prepare to walk down one of the most photographed runways in the world, under my own name, I understood how much of a lie that had been. "Daniel," Genevieve said quietly, stepping closer. "Can I tell you something before the show starts? Of course, I didn't build this collection with you because it made strategic sense," she said, her voice softer now, stripped of the boardroom precision she usually carried, like armor. "I could have hired any designer in the industry. I chose you because working beside you these past few months has been the first time in years I've actually looked forward to walking into my own office. I felt something tighten in my chest, warm and unfamiliar. "Genevieve, let me finish," she said, a small, nervous laugh escaping her, the first time I'd ever heard her sound anything less than completely composed. "I spent years building an empire by making sure I never needed anyone. It was safer that way, cleaner. And then I met a man who'd spent 8 years making someone else's empire possible, without ever once asking to be seen for it. And I realized the two of us had been solving the exact same problem, in opposite, equally lonely ways." She reached up and adjusted my bow tie, her fingers steady, despite the tremor I could hear underneath her words, smoothing the fabric with a care that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with something neither of us had said out loud yet. "I don't want a business partnership that just happens to work well," she said. "I want the real thing, whatever that means for us, whenever you're ready for it to mean that." I looked at her, really looked, the way I hadn't let myself fully do in the weeks since that first rainy night, too cautious after everything with Victoria to trust that being wanted could exist without a hidden condition attached to it. But there was nothing hidden in Genevieve's expression. No calculation, no leverage, no unspoken agenda, just quiet, patient honesty. "I think," I said slowly, "true partnership might be the only thing I actually know how to build well." Her eyes softened, and she leaned up, pressing a gentle kiss to my cheek, her hand resting briefly against my jaw. "Then let's build it," she murmured, "the same way we built everything else, together." The stage manager's voice cut through the backstage noise, calling the 5-minute warning, and the room shifted into its final controlled chaos. Genevieve squeezed my hand once before stepping back, already transforming into the composed, confident woman the industry expected to see tonight, though the softness in her eyes lingered just a moment longer, meant only for me. I turned back to the gown one last time, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the fabric, my name stitched quietly into the inside seam, where only I would ever know it was there. For the first time in a decade, that was enough. Not because I still believed in staying invisible, but because I finally understood the difference between hiding and simply not needing everyone to see me at once. Tonight, the world would see the work, and for the first time, it would also see me. From the very last row of the main hall, tucked into a seat she'd had to buy under a different name just to avoid being recognized at the door, Victoria watched the show begin. I didn't know she was there, not at first. It was one of Genevieve's assistants who spotted her during the second look, whispering the news backstage between changes. A woman in a plain black coat, sitting alone in the cheapest section of the venue, far from the front row seats she used to occupy like they belonged to her by birthright. Nobody stopped her. Nobody needed to. She wasn't a threat anymore. She was just a spectator now, the same as everyone else in that room, watching a show she no longer had any claim to. I found out later that she'd sold nearly everything to afford even that nosebleed ticket. Her remaining shares long gone, her name quietly scrubbed from the industry's guest lists, her calls to old contacts going unreturned one by one as the fashion world moved on without her, the way it always eventually does. She hadn't come to protest. She hadn't come to cause a scene. As far as anyone could tell, she'd simply wanted to see it, to watch, In person, the empire she'd once ruled, now belonging entirely to someone else. Backstage, I had no idea any of this was happening. I was focused on the final look, checking every seam, one last time, as the model stepped into the emerald gown, the one I'd spent 11 nights perfecting, the one with my name stitched quietly into a seam only I would ever see. 2 minutes, the stage manager called. Genevieve appeared beside me, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the diamonds at her ears or the tailored black dress she wore. She looked at the gown, then at me, and something passed between us that didn't need words. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," I said. The show unfolded exactly the way we'd planned it, each look building toward the next, the collection telling a story we'd built together over months of long nights and quiet conversations, fabric and thread standing in for everything neither of us had fully said out loud yet. The crowd's energy shifted with every piece, murmurs of appreciation growing louder, phones raised to capture looks that would be dissected by critics and copied by competitors within the week. Then the final model stepped out in the emerald gown, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath at once. I watched from the wings as she moved down the runway, the fabric catching the light exactly the way I'd imagined it would the first time I sketched the design on a hotel notepad months ago, back when I was still just a quiet husband nobody thought to ask about. The silence in the hall lasted only a few seconds before it broke into something else entirely. Applause rising fast and unrestrained, cameras flashing in a steady wave of white light, the kind of reaction that didn't need a publicist's spin to be understood as genuine. Genevieve took my hand. "Come on," she said. "This part's for both of us." We walked out together at the end, following the last model down the runway, and the applause somehow grew even louder. Not polite acknowledgement, but a full standing ovation, the entire hall rising to its feet at once. I saw faces I recognized from years of standing quietly in Victoria's shadow at events just like this one, faces that had never once bothered to learn my name. Tonight, they were looking directly at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the urge to step back out of the light. Somewhere in the back row, I later learned, Victoria sat frozen through the entire ovation, watching the moment unfold from the cheapest seat in the building. She didn't clap. She didn't leave either. She just sat there, perfectly still, watching the man she'd once called unambitious take a bow beside the woman who had built an entirely new empire around the talent Victoria had spent 8 years hiding. By the time the house lights came up fully, she was already gone, slipping out a side exit before anyone in the crowd could recognize her, before any photographer could capture the moment for a headline she'd never be able to control. I didn't see her leave. I didn't need to. Somebody told me afterward that she'd been crying quietly in the dark before she disappeared, and I found I didn't feel the satisfaction I once might have expected from that image. I just felt finished, genuinely, completely finished with that chapter of my life. Backstage, after the crowd had thinned and the adrenaline had started to settle into something calmer, Genevieve found me sitting quietly beside the now empty gown rack, still catching my breath from everything the night had held. "You did that," she said, sitting beside me. "All of it. The world just watched you become exactly who you always were." I thought about the man who had signed those divorce papers 3 months ago, soaked in rain, certain that walking away from Victoria meant walking away from everything that mattered. I thought about how wrong that fear had turned out to be. "We did it," I corrected softly, echoing the words she'd said to me weeks earlier. Genevieve smiled, resting her head lightly against my shoulder as the last of the backstage lights dimmed around us. Outside, the city moved on exactly the way it always did. Indifferent to endings, indifferent to beginnings, simply continuing forward the way cities do. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't disappearing into that indifference. I was standing fully in the light, finally seen, finally home.